This episode is sponsored by Happy Ears earplugs. As a neurodivergent traveler myself, I sometimes struggle in loud, overstimulating environments, especially when I'm traveling. So I always like to make sure that I have earplugs. But did you know that 1 billion disposable earplugs are thrown away every year? Happy Ears, however, are tackling that with their ocean plastics range made from 100% recycled ocean plastics. They've been amazing at helping me cope with traveling, and I find it much easier to function when I'm using them. Not only that, they are perfect for sustainable travelers, particularly because of their ocean plastics range. Get their Ocean Discovery Pack at happyearsearplugs.com to find the perfect size to suit your ears. Welcome to the Sustainable Travel Podcast. This is a podcast that interviews a range of different travelers from different backgrounds to see what sustainable travel means to them. Today, I'm here with Kirsten Doyle, who is a digital creator and autistic traveller who's sharing tips for neurodivergent people to help them when they're traveling. So, hi, Kirsten.
Hi, thanks
How
for
are you
having
doing?
me.
Yeah, no problem. You're very, very welcome. I'm so happy to have you. I know we've chatted a bit about this before, but it's really good to have you on the podcast. I think it's going to be like a fun series of. So for those who don't know, we're doing a little series of kind of podcasts on accessibility within sustainable travel and how that's going to work. So today is going to be part one. So Kirsten, in your own words, can you tell us a little bit more about you and what it is that you do?
Yeah, so about me, I was born in South Africa in right at the end of the 1960s, so I'm old.
Not at all.
I was a child at a time when not much was known about autism, and a lot of people weren't diagnosed with autism, particularly girls. There was an epidemic of people in my generation, girls specifically, who missed out on getting a diagnosis
Mhm.
because people just didn't recognize the signs in girls. So I was only diagnosed about 10 years ago.
Mhm.
I What prompted me to get an assessment was the diagnosis of my own son, George, who is high needs autistic.
Mhm.
And like I said, I was born in South Africa. I now live in Canada. I've still got family back in South Africa, so I travel quite a bit. I travel back to visit them, and I have had to kind of adapt some of the ways I travel because of the autism. I also have an anxiety disorder, and I've had to learn some pretty hard lessons along the way. So I figured, why don't I take those lessons, turn them into content, and hopefully help other people?
I love that. Yeah, so for those who don't know, I'm also neurodivergent, and I actually was diagnosed with autism really recently and had no idea, even despite how far we have come. And it was super interesting to me because I'm very high masking, and people around me were saying, "Oh, this makes so much sense now. Like
Mhm.
we now understand."
Exactly. When I was first diagnosed, I called up my best friend from South Africa. We've been best friends since we were 10, so she knows me really, really well. And I said to her, so it turns out that I'm autistic. And she just kind of goes, yeah, and like I've known this for years.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's like, you didn't think to tell me? Like,
Yeah.
they don't, I don't think they realize. And then when you learn, it's so like, it really helps, doesn't it?
Mhm.
And I think, especially when it comes to travel, there's a lot of things that I realized, I thought this was stressing me out or like making me worried, but actually it is a form of neurodivergence and there's ways that I can adapt and deal with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know I've also got a diagnosed anxiety disorder, and we are now sort of, as we learn more about autism and anxiety, we're kind of learning that in a lot of cases, anxiety is part of the autism. It's all connected.
Mm. I think that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah,
And you said you got diagnosed 10 years ago now?
about 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I think since then, really the testing and the way that we process autism has come so far, but there's obviously still work to be done. But I see a lot of the time people saying, well, everybody's neurodivergent now, everybody's autistic now, and this kind of thing. I've actually even had that said to me by family members.
Yeah, I've had that said to me many times.
It's wild, isn't it?
Um, yeah, I find it quite dismissive of the challenges that we live with.
I find it very rude. I
Yeah.
didn't respond very positively to it. But I think it's not that. What it is that essentially the testing has improved. What we know about autism as a disability or as just a neurodivergence has really improved as well. And we can really spot those signs in so many people and in women, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it did used to be obviously men that were mostly getting diagnosed, which is because all the testing is done on men.
Well, I mean, a lot of the symptoms of autism that manifest in early childhood are characteristics that society has kind of ingrained in us that should be displayed in girls.
Really?
The sort of being um, being less social, being quieter, being sort of shy, introverted. All of those are qualities that used to be highly valued in girls, and whereas boys are expected to be outgoing and rambunctious and social and talk a lot.
Yeah, that's so true. I hadn't even thought about that. I bet there's
Yeah,
a load of reasons for it that are probably rooted in, unfortunately, in sexism within the medical communities as well, which is so unfortunate, but I'm glad it's progressing. Um,
yeah.
so, for listeners who are not aware of this, can you expand a little bit more on what it means to be an autistic traveller for you from your perspective?
So for me, yeah, so it is important to recognize that autism looks different in everybody, in every autistic person. There's a saying that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And so for myself, me and my son are both autistic, but it looks so different in both of us. And for me, being an autistic traveler is challenging because one of my biggest challenges is that I have trouble processing audio inputs. So if I have multiple sounds and noises coming at me from multiple directions, I kind of shut down. And I get claustrophobic when there was a lot of people around me, and and when all of this is compounded with bright fluorescent lights,
Yeah,
it's overwhelming. And the other thing is that travel is inherently something that you can plan and plan and plan and plan, and something's going to change. And there is a stereotype that's kind of true that autistic people don't deal well with changes in schedules and plans, and that is definitely me. When plans change, I'm like, what now? So
yeah.
So when I plan travel, I kind of have to plan it to the next level, and I have to contingency plan, and well, what if this happens? Well, they're going to do that and that and that, and so it is challenging in
Yeah.
several ways.
It's really funny because I have ADHD as well. So I'm like, I love changing plans, but my autism hates them. So
Yes.
like a plan will change and I'm like, oh, exciting. Like, what do we do now? And I kind of go into crisis mode. And then a day later or 3 days later, I'm like, that was awful. That was horrible. It's so stressful. And it does funny things to me, like in hindsight, in like a weird way.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And another fun fact is that autism and ADHD are usually very closely linked as well. When I got my autism diagnosis, my doctor said, we could screen you for ADHD, but we're not going to bother because you've probably got it, and
Okay.
it's part of the autism. And yeah, and I hear you, and I can actually be quite spontaneous, and I have to sort of let that side of me come out a little bit.
Yeah.
So my travel plans always have to include a little bit of unscheduled time where I can kind of just sort of go where the flow takes me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but yeah, when it comes to the actual logistics of travel, I'm very much a planner. I'm going to be going to South Africa again, probably in November. And I'm going to probably have those flights booked by the end of February.
Yeah. And you should.
Yeah.
You should. I think when it comes to this like intersection of ADHD and autism, I used to think I was not a I used to think I was a very spontaneous person and not a planner because I do really like this like kind of changing plans and that kind of thing. And then most of the listeners know, but I did a 6 month backpacking trip through Africa for my honeymoon with my husband. And the way I planned that, my God, I've never planned anything. I had spreadsheets. I had, and I was like, everybody was like, you've literally planned 6 months of your
Oh my
life.
gosh. Yeah.
But
Yeah, and this was a challenge for me actually. Actually, last time I was in London it was about 3 years ago now, 2 or 3, no, I think about 3 years ago with my son, my
mhm,
younger son, James. And as is typical of me, everything was planned down to the 99th detail. But then that happened to be the day in London that it snowed. And um, when it snows in London, no
shuts
offense,
down.
but like Londoners kind of lose their minds a little bit.
They do.
And us the Canadians are there going, like there's this much snow, like what? What is the big deal? And we were in Birmingham for the day, meeting up with a friend of mine, and we were getting the train from Birmingham back to London, which should be like what, like maybe a 2 hour train ride. It's not that deep.
Mhm.
That train ride took 5 hours.
I'm not even surprised.
And then we got to London, and then we intentionally picked a hotel close to a tube station. So we think, oh, we'll just get the tube from the train station back to the hotel. No, every single tube line that was available to us was shut down.
Yeah, which is the tube is underground. There's no snow
Yeah.
there.
And then we had to wait forever. Well, we had to spend a fortune on taxi fees and Uber fees that we weren't anticipating. And all of that change was just so, and I did melt down a little bit. Fortunately, my non-autistic son was with me to sort of calm me down.
Situation.
But then we flew out of Gatwick the following day. And when it snowed, on the day that it snowed, all of the planes going into Gatwick were diverted to other airports.
Mm-hmm.
So on the day we were flying back to Paris, all of those planes had to be flown in from elsewhere so that they could then fly out of Gatwick. And I was just thinking, if you're a pilot and you cannot fly in like 2 centimeters of snow, should you even be flying?
Yeah.
but but that completely, and on the fly, I had to completely change all of the plans that we'd made for Paris, because we
Mm.
spent a couple of days in Paris. And okay, so we got these bookings for the Eiffel Tower and this thing and that thing, and all of it had to change. Fortunately, we were able to change things, but it was very stressful.
Yeah. And for the listeners who don't know, could you just briefly explain what is a meltdown?
It is when your brain kind of short circuits because too many things are going on. It's literally, if you imagine an electrical, like a breaker board in that you find in anyone's house, and you have one breaker that runs, let's say everything that's in your kitchen, but then you plug in your microwave, you use your microwave, your dishwasher, and then you plug in some, too many things for that circuit to handle. That circuit's going to trip,
Yeah.
and then everything is just going to stop working. That is what a meltdown is like.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
like you're just overloading your electrical circuits.
for sure. And it manifests so differently in every single person. So
Yeah. So
just
sometimes, and it manifests differently in me. Just depending on what the situation is. I've had times when I have literally just kind of stood there, and this happened when I
freeze.
was boarding a plane in Paris, flying to Johannesburg, because not to call out individual companies, but I will call out individual companies. Air France, terrible with accessibility for invisible disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
They're not good. They would not allow me to pre-board, and so I had to board with general boarding, and that flight was full, and it was just overwhelming for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I get halfway down the jet bridge,
Mm-hmm.
and then I just kind of stop. I literally physically stop moving.
Yeah,
And the people behind me are going like, "What's going on?" Blah, blah, blah. And the more they're yelling at
that's
me,
worse.
the more I'm freezing up.
Yeah.
And then people just kind of start pushing past me. And one of the ramp agents eventually, I guess, saw me just kind of freezing up and took me to one side, and that person helped me. I mean, that's not even an airline employee, that's someone employed by the airport. So that was an example of me just totally freezing up. But then I had another incident, which I can go into more detail in later on if you want. I was flying back into Toronto during COVID, right after the government had changed quarantine requirements, and the airport was an absolute zoo. It was total chaos.
Yeah.
And I had all of these people, like all of these immigration people and security people trying to approach me all at once. And I just went into a full-on panic attack.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was really scary. And I think it was scary for them too. Like, they thought I was having a heart attack. They had me there. They called a doctor. They, had me checked out. So depending on the circumstances, a meltdown can look very different from one day to the next.
100%. And as a high masking person, for me, it also looks different. Like sometimes it can be that I hide it until the very end of the day, and then it can be like a temper tantrum, like a full-on temper tantrum.
Yeah.
Then other days it is that
Yeah.
freezing thing that you said. Like once I was trying to do my garden and there was like too many tasks in the garden, and I just stood there. And
Yeah.
Murray's like, we need to move. And I was like, it's too much. And I've never done that before. I've never frozen. So that was a real like new experience for me. But I love the way you describe it as like a short circuit. Like there's just too many things. And it obviously when you're traveling, that's kind of what happens.
The problem. Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. And so that was kind of how it manifests for you. What about you? You mentioned your son. Do you mind sharing a little bit of how travel can affect him?
Yeah, so where it actually makes traveling with him a little bit challenging, because when it comes to sensory inputs, I'm very sensitive to noise.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is the opposite. He's a sensory seeker when it comes to noise. He likes the loud noises.
Interesting.
And but he doesn't like the bright lights. He's a lot more sensitive to the lights than I am. So he has to wear a hat.
Right.
Like anytime we're in an airport, he has to wear a hat just to shield his eyes from the lights. And he needs a lot of space around him.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not great in crowds, and he stims by jumping up and down.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are in airports, we have to make time, and this is something that always happens. Every time I go into an airport, I know that I'm going to have an anxiety attack. It's gonna happen. There's no point fighting. It's so I just, and this is why I get to airports as early as I do.
Yeah.
I get to the airport, immediately find a quiet spot where I can have my anxiety moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know it's gonna happen. I'm not gonna fight it. I may as well just let it happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to get myself into a safe space where I can happen. And if my son is traveling with me while I'm having my moment, he'll be jumping up and down doing his stimming.
It's like these two working against each other completely. Oh, and could you very briefly explain stimming as well? Sorry, I'm just conscious there may be terms that people aren't like as familiar with.
Yeah, so stimming it's literally self-stimulation. It's repetitive motions. Different people do different things, and it kind of helps soothe the mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there used to be a trend of people, and I think a lot of people still do have a tendency to correct autistic children who are stimming. To tell them to don't do that. But the thing is, autistic people stim for a reason.
Yeah.
And stimming just allows us, because we have this buildup of energy, and it kind of creates an outlet that prevents that short circuit from happening.
Yeah, 100%. So I guess what we're saying, when you're traveling as an autistic person, by you I mean one, like there's a lot going on, and it's kind of a case that we have to navigate through that to try and stay calm, because we don't express our emotions in the same way as neurotypical people.
Yeah, and what makes it harder is that part of being autistic and anxious and introverted is that I have a pathological inability to ask for help.
Right.
I can be suffering like crazy and having the worst time, And there can be people standing right there who would be willing to help,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to ask for help. I
Yeah.
just it's too I just
Overwhelming.
yeah, I just cannot do it. It's an interaction that I'm very uncomfortable with.
Yeah. And I think it can turn us into different people as well, because for me, like when I'm overwhelmed, like, I can get quite snappy and maybe like sort of, I wouldn't want to ask for help, but I might like demand it in a way just by my behavior,
Yeah.
which is not something I like in myself either. And it's not something that I do on a day to day, of course. Um, okay. And then when it comes to kind of the intersectionality of sustainability within that, what would you say the difficulties are? Like, are there times where you've had to prioritize your own welfare or your own accessibility or your son's welfare and accessibility over being more sustainable?
I mean, kind of yes and no. Um, some of the things that we need, some of the accommodations that would help us actually do align with sustainability. So for
Mhm.
instance, do airports do they have to be so loud?
Mhm.
Do they have to have so many announcements over loudspeakers? Do they have to be putting in lighting as bright as they do? I feel like airports in general are, in this day and age, have been over engineered.
Mhm.
There is a lot, like I said, a lot of lights, a lot of sounds. When I'm traveling through an airport, I don't need to be listening to background music.
Mhm.
The background music is compounding the sounds of everything else that's going on around me. Do they need to have so many announcements? Put more display boards up
Mhm.
so that people can visually see, yeah, and make some accessible display boards, accessible things for people with so for people who are blind, obviously
Mhm.
display boards aren't any help to them,
Mhm.
but give them a space where they can get some audio inputs, but make
That's
the
really
airport overall a quieter place. Take out some of those bright lights, take out some of those shiny surfaces that we know were not created. They were not manufactured in sustainable ways.
yeah. Yeah, it's true. Like actually, if I think about it, if I don't know if you've been to Abu Dhabi Airport.
I haven't.
No, they have like a wall of flowers and nature just inside the airport.
Yeah.
And I love it. Like when I'm going through Abu Dhabi Airport, because my stepdad used to live there, it really calms me down, like that kind of
Mm-hmm.
area. And I would love to see that, like more kind of natural spaces within airports, less like artificial lighting, as you said, less like they obviously use a lot of energy. They're on 24/7. Um, and it is a very like overwhelming environment as well.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I specifically choose to travel through Schiphol Airport a lot
mm,
is that they are doing. I don't know if you've delved into this at all, but Schiphol are doing an amazing job at making their processes sustainable.
no, I haven't done too much
And
research.
and they have a goal, and I don't remember what their target year is, but they have a goal of being pretty much off the electrical grid by
Mhm.
a certain year.
That's really cool. I like
And they
Schiphol.
and they're doing this through, they're using a lot of they're reducing the use of gas. They're putting some processes in place to reduce the carbon footprint of the actual flights themselves. So, for
Hmm.
instance, they're on some flights they're doing extended pushbacks.
Hmm.
So instead of the just pushing the plane back out of the gate, it'll push the plane like quite far down the taxiway,
Hmm.
which means the plane needs it's delayed startup for the airplane and less gas being used by the plane itself.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that about
So
Schiphol.
yeah, Amsterdam they're doing a really really good job. So I like to travel through there not only because they are quite good with accessibility, but also because they are making these efforts.
Yeah, and they definitely have those spaces where you can go and just like decompress a little. Like they have little reading nooks last time I was there
They've
as
got
well.
Yeah, and they've got that one clock. I mean, I could look at their clock for ages, and it looks like a guy like washing the hands of the clock away and then redrawing them.
Oh, that's cool. I haven't seen it.
That is so cool. I'll send you a video clip of it later on.
Yeah, I do.
It is super cool, and it looks like a workman in overalls standing behind a pane of glass,
Hmm.
and he paints a line on the
Hmm.
clock, and then he kind of stands there, and then he gets like a mop and he washes off the line, and then he draws the next line.
Oh, that's very cool. I love
It is so cool. And the first time I saw that clock, I actually thought there was a guy there.
that. Is it like really small?
No, it's a big
Oh,
clock. It's
wow.
a big clock in one of the terminals. Yeah, it is so fun to watch.
Yeah.
But
I,
yeah, Amsterdam Airport has a lot, and I think one of the things we can do to support sustainable travel, and especially for me, that all of my travel involves flying.
mhm,
There's no way I can get around that, and flying is inherently not sustainable.
mhm.
But what I can do is support the airports and the airlines that are making an effort.
Yeah, that are doing good things. And
Yeah.
what about train travel or bus travel, that kind of thing? Would that be a bit overwhelming, do you think?
You know what? Just on my most recent trip, I discovered train travel in Europe, and I actually enjoyed it. The train trip itself was fine, but I was initially booked from Toronto to Paris on Air France.
Hmm.
But Air France, I'm assuming, overbooked. But then the second issue was that the Air Canada flight was then delayed by about an hour and a half, which resulted in me missing the Eurostar train that I booked.
Ah, okay, that's annoying.
But then I had to deal with the train stations in Paris.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other thing. And train travel itself is more sustainable than air travel. And I do want to find a way to use train travel when I'm traveling in Europe. But the train stations well, specifically in Paris and in Europe in general, I find to be really fraught. And then, so I was in this crowd, and this was a train station that I'd never been in. And so it's an unfamiliar environment, which is, number one. Number two was this change in plans that resulted in me missing my train.
Yeah.
Then there was the crowds, and I was having to deal with, how am I going to get onto the next train? The train manager of the next train told me that I would have to pay €109 to get onto the next train, which that kind of made me shut down, because it was
Yeah.
like,
That's the last
you
thing you
know,
need to hear.
fortunately, I got the seat on the train, but no one ever came to take payment from me.
Oh, that's good. So you didn't end up
So,
having to pay. That's
so
a
that worked
win-win.
out well. But yeah, so it is, to go back to your question, it is a bit of a conflict, because yeah, the train travel itself is good, and I actually enjoyed the train ride.
Yeah.
It's a very nice way to see the countryside. But in order to travel on a train, you have to deal with being in a train station.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is something people don't often think about unless they're on the other side of it. So for me, I travel a lot by train, especially because my work used to take me to mainland Europe from the UK. Um, and the Gare du Nord, as you've said, in Paris is absolute chaos. Like it's got the upstairs level is the Eurostar, the downstairs level is the regional trains, but there's no signposts for where you need to be. There's,
Yeah.
I mean, I speak French, but I can imagine people who don't must just be absolutely beside themselves because there's nothing in English, like which is kind of wild when you consider that they're a very like crucial hub between the
Yeah.
UK and Europe. And then like all the trains are there's half of them are going at like 1 minute past the hour, then 3 minutes past. They're all like so close together. And there's not really anybody to help you. So
No. I
when
found
we talk,
it was so hard to get help there. And and the people were a little bit more abrasive than I
yeah.
generally like them to be.
Well, I mean, they're not set up for it like airports, like they
No.
don't have the same system. So that's definitely a great point that when it comes to accessibility within sustainable travel, even within Europe, that's arguably one of the best continents to take a train, it's not set up right.
It's not set up right at all. And that is the one thing that could make me lean more toward air travel, because at least Number one, I am more familiar with airport processes in general.
Hmm.
Train travel is something that's fairly new to me. But the other thing is the airports have been doing a lot of work
Yeah.
to
Yes.
improve accessibility for people with invisible disabilities. The train stations need to start doing the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. So I really think this is a great point to talk about the fact that, like, obviously trains need to be doing a little bit more if people are going to be actively choosing them over flying, because not even just within like communities that have access needs, there is like resistance to taking trains because it's more difficult. But can we also talk about, so when you travel to places, would you be in the frame of mind of, say, just rushing through and maybe doing like one night here, one night there, one night there? Or would you, because of your autism, perhaps try and slow things down a bit, and spend more time?
Actually, do a bit of both. Um, so I fly to South Africa. I always think, well, there was so much of Europe that I want to see.
Hmm.
So I just combine it with my layovers.
Hmm.
And because I figure I'm going there anyway, and that is actually another thing that I do to support sustainable travel. Instead of just flying through a place,
Mm.
I will take a couple of days, book some time in a hotel,
Hmm.
and actually spend time in that place so I
Yeah.
can visit. And this most recent trip, I went to Bruges in Belgium.
Mhm.
Absolutely loved it there.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think still that kind of aspect of like just visiting maybe one place where you're stopping over rather than rushing straight through, even like as you say, that is still a way of slowing things down and maybe trying to see a bit more.
Yeah, it is, and it's actually it has another purpose as well. When I visit a place, I can see if I want to go back to that place
Yeah.
for a longer time at some point in the future. So, for instance, I really like Amsterdam,
Mm.
but I know I probably need a longer time there.
Yeah.
I need to spend a good week there to do the things I know I want to do.
Yeah.
Whereas in Bruges, I absolutely loved it there, had
Mm.
such a good time. Actually found it quite a magical place, but I don't ever need to go back there
Yeah.
because
You're done now.
number one, I've seen every. I wouldn't say I've seen everything, but I've seen probably most of what there is to see in Bruges. I've experienced it in a very nice way, and the other thing is I'd be afraid that if I went back there, it would kind of pop that bubble of magic from the first
Mm.
time. So I don't
Yeah.
need to go back to Bruges.
Yeah, I understand that. It's kind of like you've seen everything you want to see. So
Yeah,
you can
and I,
close
and I
that
wanted to
chapter.
hold on to that memory.
Yeah.
But and spending shorter periods of time in a place is actually quite useful because yeah, do I want to go back to Paris? Absolutely. But I mean, there was so much in Paris and in France in general
Mm.
that
Mm.
I wouldn't want to do that on a layover. I'd want to do that on a longer trip that I am taking specifically for that purpose.
Yeah, so it gives you like a little taster and then you can head back if you want to. I love repeat travel as well. It's one of my favorite things. Um, and the other thing I thought of as well when it comes to accessibility that can be quite difficult, like a lot of a lot of hotels that are perhaps like locally run or um guest houses, I guess, rather than chain hotels, it's my experience that they don't necessarily have the same practices in place that are as easy to understand and clear to follow. So it's kind of more of a free for all. And I know sometimes, well, what's your opinion? Like, do you think for autistic travelers and those with severe neurodivergence, it's easier to know what they're getting with a hotel?
I think for myself, I prefer the smaller kind of boutique hotels.
Hmm.
um, because I find the people who run them to be a lot more approachable
Yeah,
and a lot friendlier. Whereas in the large chain hotels, you're just another person,
yeah, yeah.
so they don't really care as much.
And they're scary. Like this, you
It
can't go and
is.
ask somebody to help you because they're just too like
It
authoritative.
is. In Bruges, I stayed at this wonderful little bed and breakfast that is run by a lady who escaped from the war in Ukraine.
Wow, that's cool.
And absolutely beautiful person. And but she has 4 rooms in this bed and breakfast that she rents out. And she cares about all of her guests, and she greets everyone by name. And she asks, like, is there anything we can do for you? Is there anything you need? And it's really, I really like that. Whereas with the
Yeah.
chains, like if you want help, you've got to go and talk to the scary person behind the front desk.
Yeah. I do think in some ways though, like some people like to know what they're getting, like they like that kind of routine of having like the same hotel. And that is something else for me where I think
Yeah.
flexibility and sustainable travel are battling each other a little bit.
Yeah, and that's where that's also one of the reasons I like the smaller, like family-run places. I think it is a better way to support local communities.
Yeah, me too, 100%. And for your page, it's kind of more focused on, I would say, giving tips to neurodivergent travelers, helping them gain the confidence. It's maybe for people who want to do it but haven't got the confidence to try. So what tips would you give them? Like, how would you say, go ahead and do it?
First thing I would say is get one of these.
Yeah.
So the Sunflower Lanyard program it actually started in Gatwick Airport.
Okay.
And because at Gatwick they recognize that there are people with invisible disabilities, and those people may not know how to ask for help. So
Yeah.
they created this program that is a visible sign for airport staff.
Mm-hmm.
So they see a lanyard, they know that that individual might need assistance or accommodations or extra time or whatever the case may be. So that person is immediately treated a little bit more slowly. They kind of slow things down for you. And this program expanded worldwide, and it encompasses a lot of airports.
Mm.
So, for instance, when I'm flying out of Toronto, as soon as I show up at the security screening area, I will be directed to an assisted disability screening area line.
Mm.
And it's quieter, shorter lines, all the rest of it. Another example, when I was flying through Amsterdam on my recent trip, Amsterdam airport was extremely busy, and the gate information for my flight kept on changing. So I'm like, okay, you told me to go there, now you're telling me to go there, now you're telling me where am I supposed to go?
Yeah.
And eventually I found the gate. And by the time I found the gate, I was feeling a little frazzled because it's just like, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah.
But then as soon as I got to the gate, a gate agent approached me, said, I see that you're wearing the lanyard, come with me, this is where you're going to sit and wait, we're going to make sure you get pre-boarding. And I didn't have to ask. And because I'd mentioned earlier, asking for help is very difficult for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And having this takes the burden off the person.
Yeah. And it's not embarrassing, is it? They just say, I see you're wearing this.
Yeah, and it's very and that's very discreet. They do it in a way that doesn't draw attention to you.
Yeah.
And it's so helpful. And some of the airports are, and that's where I saw Charles de Gaulle Airport. They seem to be making more efforts. I think they've joined the Sunflower Lanyard program fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I got off the plane flying into Paris, I was immediately directed to shorter lines, which was really great for the airport staff. It was so good to see. They've got some way to go.
Yeah.
They're not as good as airports like Amsterdam or even Toronto, but they're better than they were. And any step in the right direction is celebrated.
Yeah, definitely. And also the great thing about the lanyard is that it kind of transcends language. So if you don't speak the language, it doesn't really matter if you've got your sunflower lanyard visible.
Yeah. So I would say, number one, get one of the lanyards. And if your local airport does not participate in the Sunflower Lanyard program, just find the next closest one that does, because most of them will mail them to you.
Yeah, or write to them, I guess. Can you ask
well,
them?
You can. Most of the airport websites that participate have an online form that you fill in. and you just put in your name and your address information, and they'll just mail it to you for free.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, it would be great if they all participated. I think for the future that would be something we
It
have to
would be
see.
great, and I'm kind of on a personal mission to get OR Tambo Airport in Johannesburg to become the first African airport to be in the program.
Yeah, that is a stressful airport.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, well, last time when I flew out of OR Tambo about almost a month ago, it was absolute chaos. The passport control line was so long that it was backing into the security screening area.
Oh my God.
And that was they don't have the sunflower lanyard program, and I really think they should.
Yeah, they really should. They really
They
should have
really
done that.
should.
So I guess the main tip then, people should get the sunflower lanyard, feel more confident, kind of saying, this is like what I'm wearing, this is who I am, and then hopefully people can start
Yeah.
to adopt
So
that.
so get the sunflower lanyard, make plans, but also understand that those plans may change without notice.
Yeah, and make a backup plan.
And exactly, make contingency plans. And something I always say is when you are planning how you're going to get from the airport to your hotel and vice versa, make two plans.
Mm-hmm.
Because you might be planning to take the train, or you might be planning to take the subway or get a taxi or whatever. What if there's a rail strike?
Mm-hmm.
Or what if you're planning to take an Uber, but there's an accident and on the highway and no Ubers are going.
Yeah, or they can't find you within the airport, which happens surprisingly often.
You know what? That something that OR Tambo recently did that I'm so glad they did. They finally put up a sign for arriving passengers to tell them where to get an Uber.
That is so useful. More airports need to do that. For you, would you say that like the airport experience can kind of make or break the trip because of how overwhelming it is?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's where that affected me going when I was on the train from Paris to Belgium.
Yeah.
I should have, and it was quite a shame, really. I should have enjoyed that train ride a lot more than I did.
Yeah. Mm.
But by the time I got onto that train, I was so stressed and so overwrought and like physically fighting back tears. And I was just
Yeah.
like, and I did kind of relax and settle into enjoying it eventually, but I wasn't able to fully relax, and it was just like, this should be a much better experience than it is.
Yeah. Didn't you travel as well to Mozambique?
Yes.
Yeah. Did
Yeah,
you like
Mozambique
it?
is lovely. I flew from OR Tambo to this little coastal village called Vilanculos.
Yeah. I've been there.
You've been to Vilanculos?
Yeah.
And absolutely wonderful. So I got to spend the time with my brother, and had access to this boat. We went out onto the islands.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And we talk about sustainable travel, which I think should always evolve. It should always exclude anything to do with animals,
Yeah.
because that's problematic. But you're in Vilanculos, you're swimming in the sea, and there's dolphins right there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's
it's just
different when
like,
it's an ethical wildlife encounter and you're just
yeah,
seeing them hands off. It's so
yeah.
different.
And when we went to one of the islands, we were swimming by the where we docked the boat, and these dolphins were so curious about us,
Wow. That's
and they weren't moving away. They were staying with us, and
nice.
that was so amazing. It was just like, wow.
Yeah.
Like this is how to do wildlife encounters ethically,
Yes,
because it's not
completely.
even planned. It's just kind of, they just happen to be there.
There was a dugong there when we were on, but I mean, it was
My
very cloudy.
brother keeps telling me about the dugong. I didn't see it.
Yeah, it was very cloudy. But it's interesting. I definitely wanted to ask you about Mozambique because for us, we did it all via public transport. And
Oh
it
my
was
God.
very overwhelming, like extremely.
I cannot
Um,
imagine.
yeah, and it's interesting. It does really like mar your impression. Like it's obviously a beautiful place. It's absolutely wonderful. And here's, two people with very different experiences who one saying like it was so peaceful, it was so lovely. And for me, by contrast, like it was extremely overwhelming. But it is like sometimes that transport side of it can make or break it when it's so overwhelming.
I can imagine. I cannot imagine trying to do public transport in Mozambique.
Yeah, I don't advise it.
Yeah. No, we had the place we were staying at. They have a jeep, and they
Mm.
picked us up from the airport, and we went through the actual village on this jeep.
And what, like, bringing back to kind of accessibility then, what would you like to see from the travel industry for like a shift in accessibility and also sustainability, I guess, but making kind of travel and sustainable travel more accessible for autistic and neurodivergent travelers?
I'd like to see them actually try to reach out to the community of people with invisible disabilities to find
Mhm,
out what they need.
mhm.
I think there are some companies and providers and venues that try to put things in place. They are well intentioned, but they don't actually know what's needed.
Mm.
So, for instance, at the Eiffel Tower, just to pick an example at random, yeah, it's nice being able to, pre-book the tickets and all of the rest of it, but it would also be nice to have some quiet spot in the tower itself where you can go when the crowd is just too much for you.
Yeah,
And they could do it.
yeah,
They could do it. They have the space to do it. Um, so,
yeah,
I, so I'd like to see that. And I'd like to see just a greater awareness of the fact that invisible disabilities exist and that they are a spectrum. They manifest in many different ways.
yeah,
Something specifically that I would like to see from the airlines, this drives me absolutely bonkers with most airlines. Air Canada is the only exception. But if you request disability assistance from the airlines currently, they just assume you need a wheelchair.
it's a huge problem in so just from a travel agency perspective, like there are certain codes that we can input. When I worked as a travel agent, there are certain codes you can input into the system. And there used to be one probably about 10, 12 years ago called Meet and Assist. And the code is MAAS. And it
Mm-hmm.
was removed. And it just sort of happened out of the
Wow.
blue. Like they just removed it because they were like, well, either like not enough people are using this, or we don't really know. It was something like we don't really know what the specific needs would be, and it's too vague. So now, even on a travel agency system, you can only request, there's three different types of wheelchair assistance you can request, and it's like power assisted, manual, or something else. And you can request assistance for visually impaired people, but
Yeah.
it's not possible just to request someone to help you through the airport. And it's challenging because when you have a client who is either autistic or just needs help, um, which can be for multiple reasons, like say for example, someone has cerebral palsy and is fine walking, doesn't need a wheelchair, but just might need some help. It's really impossible.
Yeah. And it's, my friend that I was telling you about, who has the service dog, encounters this. She cannot check in online. She cannot check in for her flights online. She has to check in person with her dog. A lot of people don't even know the laws when it comes to service animals.
Yeah, that's another thing that's really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, for for that kind of thing, I think it would be really useful if they would have this particular service like Meet and Assist, they could bring that back. I
Yeah.
would love to see, as you said, a bit of awareness that people are not all the same. And just because you've interviewed,
Mm-hmm.
say, one person with an invisible disability and they've said they need this, that's fantastic, but maybe take a wider pool.
Yeah.
Mm. And
So that's what I'd like to see. And I would like to see more airports put in more intuitive signage. Like
mhm.
navigating through some airports is, like at the airport in Paris, I always have a hard time with the signs there.
Yeah. And I think like even just linguistically there's a barrier, but then when you also add a neurodivergence to that, it's like, okay, this is really
Yeah,
overwhelming. Yeah.
yeah,
I think I would like to see as well, like definitely the train stations that you mentioned, like that's kind of got me thinking too. And I'm like, it's definitely a barrier that it's not as like, I guess with an airport, even though it's overwhelming, there's sort of like a flow, right? Like, okay,
yeah,
right, I go baggage, then I go through security, then after security, I go to passport control, after passport control, I go through the gate, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of, how it goes. Whereas with a train station, it is kind of a free for all. And it's like, when do I turn up for my train? How long do I
yeah,
leave between trains? Where do I go when I get there? Like, do I need to do any kind of pre-check? Because in Europe, you need to sometimes get your ticket stamped. So
yeah.
do I need to do that? It's a lot.
Yeah, an interesting thing here in Toronto, our main train network here in Southern Ontario is called Metrolinx.
Hmm.
And Metrolinx have joined the Sunflower Lanyard program.
Nice.
So, some of the individual train stations haven't, but the actual train network itself has, which is great. And um, I think more needs to be done. Otherwise, people with invisible disabilities are just going to fly everywhere they need to go because at least the airports and an increasing number of airlines are starting to put those processes in place to support people with invisible disabilities.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I'd love
definitely.
to see the train stations doing more.
Yeah, and more awareness, I think, of what can be a challenge for someone with an invisible disability, because you mentioned earlier, like it's not all transport, right? You mentioned earlier the Eiffel Tower and how that can be very overwhelming, especially when they have like the light show going on, then there's crowds everywhere, and it's like, oh my God, like
Yeah,
there does need to be some like it's for example, there are warnings when flashing lights are about to go off because of epileptics. So
right,
why do we not have something like that? Like this is going to be a busy area. You can go in this quiet area, like a quiet coach on a train.
right.
Yeah, I would love to see more of that.
Yeah.
Um, and then, so just my final question, Kirsten, what are you working on at the moment and where can people find you?
I'm actually working on a bunch of things. I do have a website, theautistictraveller.com. And that's traveler with two L's, by the way, because the Americans spell it with one.
Yeah.
So yeah, theautistictraveller.com. I can also be found on Instagram and TikTok
Mhm.
and YouTube.
You're everywhere.
Yeah, I am pretty much everywhere, and I am about to join a program funded by the provincial government here
Mhm.
that will give me some training, and ultimately I will get my travel agent certification.
Amazing. So you might know a
Yeah,
lot of what I've been talking about in this then.
yeah. So I would like to be able to that'll make it easier for me to help people with invisible disabilities, and that'll be my area of focus.
That's fantastic. That's such a cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been the Sustainable Travel Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at the Sustainable Travel Podcast. Or we also, and do not forget, please, to rate and subscribe to our Spotify and also to the YouTube. Or you can find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook group called Sustainable Travel Tips Group. Thank you so much.